Hey, welcome to another episode of Coffee with Kiyonah. Cheers. May you be blessed. Today I'm going to share my thoughts with you about being a sovereign being, what it means to be sovereign. And I'm not an intellectual, so I don't know much about it. I only know my personal experience in my journey. And what it is to be sovereign, even in the midst of somehow being institutionalized or enslaved by the establishment, the empire, Babylon, or whatever you want to call it. How do you maintain your sovereignty in your consciousness, in your physical life, in your emotions, in your relationships, and everything else? In a cool way, that leads to a good life, where you are an embodiment of your ideal self rather than an outcast or a failure or whatever they want to call it when you refuse to comply with their expectations and their standards and their dictates, of what's good, what's acceptable, what's meaningful, etc. So I'm also talking about cool books these days, and the book I'm going to look at today is called The Wanderer by Khalil Gibran. When I picture and think about what is a sovereign being like, what do they act like, what do they look like, what do they think like, what do they feel like, and I'm sure there's many ways of being a sovereign being, but he's one of the people that comes to mind in my mind when I think of being a sovereign being, walking through the world, where your divine self is the captain of your ship, but yet your earthly self is in this dimension and in these paradigms and in these systems and institutions. So to me it feels kind of like walking in two worlds at the same time, or two blended dimensions or something like that. It says it was published in January of 1932 by Alfred Knopf, Inc. And there's a poem on page 42 called The Madman. It was in the garden of a madhouse that I met a youth with a pale face and lovely and full of wonder. And I sat beside him upon the bench, and I said, "Why are you here?" And he looked at me in astonishment, and he said, "It is an unseemly question, yet I will answer you. My father would make of me a reproduction of himself. So also would my uncle. My mother would have me be the image of her illustrious father. My sister would hold up her seafaring husband as the perfect example for me to follow. My brother thinks I should be like him, a fine athlete. And my teachers also, the doctor of philosophy and the music master and the logician, they too were determined, and each would have me be a reflection of his own face in a mirror. Therefore, I came to this place. I find it more sane here. At least here I can be myself." Then all of a sudden he turned to me and he said, "But tell me, were you also driven to this place by education and good counsel?" And I answered, "No, I am a visitor." And he said, "Oh, you are one of those who live in the madhouse on the other side of the wall." That's very interesting. So he's confined to a madhouse because he would not conform to everyone's expectations, And there in the asylum, he can be himself and not have to be like anyone else. So he did find freedom and sovereignty in that situation. And the visitor who believes that he's free is the one who's actually living in a real madhouse on the outside, where you have to put up with all kinds of insanity on all kinds of spectrums. It's very interesting to think about. This book does have some illustrations. This particular copy feels very old. I think it's from 1960, but it's got pictures like this. The front of the book says that he completed this book shortly before his death, and in 1931, and in these beautiful parables and drawings are crystallized his whole life message, a message that has consoled and inspired thousands of readers since its publication. I'm seeing if anything jumps out at me. Being a sovereign being. How do you do that? Well, first you decide to start thinking for yourself and deciding how you really feel about things, you know. And at first that is just like oppositional to what you've been doing, but eventually it becomes deeper and more meaningful and poetic and sublime the deeper you go into the wisdoms of life. And especially if you surround yourself and enrich your environment with good books, good music, good art, good everything, you are enriched so that you have an abundance of consciousness to be a sovereign being, because you're not just surviving in slavery. You can be a slave and not be enslaved.